Hello all, and welcome to Module 2's Sexual Differentiation and Development lecture. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We're going to start by defining a few terms, and we're going to start with the term sex, which seems pretty easy. And it is. It's essentially based on your chromosomal structure. If you're a female, you've got XX. If you're a male, you've got XY, or any number of combinations that actually result in what we call intersex individuals. And you should review pages 133 and 136 in your textbook. They do a really good review of a few of these different types of combinations that can result. They've got a good table in the textbook that can help you with that. And so oftentimes, most students that take this course aren't surprised that gender is on a spectrum, and also that sexual orientation is on a spectrum. But as well, sex is on a spectrum, because again, we don't just have males and females, we also have intersex individuals. And so that makes it kind of connects everything. And so if sex itself, biological sex, is on a continuum, it is logical to assume that also gender and orientation will also be on a spectrum. And these things are all interconnected. And so we're going to use this lecture, we're going to primarily focus on biology and the foundation of biology that informs our gender and our sexual orientation. Gender, instead of being based in biology, instead is more of a cultural designation, but it is tightly bound to our physical self, or our biological sex. And so the terms that are used to describe gender have a range of identities, and they can register anywhere from masculine to feminine to androgynous, which usually is a combination of masculine and feminine traits. And so gender has, with these three main kind of goal lines, masculine, feminine, and androgynous, can have any number of expressions set on this continuum. Sexual orientation is associated with the gender or genders that an individual is attracted to. And essentially, it's who someone wants to love in a sexual way. One last thing that sometimes surprises students, in addition to the fact that sex is not a binary category, it is on a continuum, is that these categories are not necessarily fixed, and they can change over time. They can change over time, especially in relation to cultural and familial acceptance or rejection. So now I promised you that we would look at false dichotomy, and we're definitely going to do that. That's a concept that's important to understand when you're talking about human sexuality and sex and gender and sexual orientation. And so let's go ahead and just define what a false dichotomy is. So a false dichotomy is something where it's a dichotomy that is not jointly exhaustive, which means there are other alternatives. It also means that it's not mutually exclusive, which means if you've got one category, then there are two, three, four other categories, or infinite categories that can be substituted, or possibly neither. And so one example of a false dichotomy is someone that might say to you, you need to go to the party with me, otherwise you're just going to be bored at home. And what the speaker is suggesting is that there are only two possibilities, either being at the party or being bored at home, which is untrue. The reality of the situation is that there are infinite possibilities besides the two that are offered by the speaker. Now, this relates to sex and gender and sexuality because we are talking often in terms of binary structures. And so lots of individuals believe that sex and gender and sexual orientation do exist as a binary, singularly focused on two categories, either male or female. And if we understand that biological sex is on a continuum, that gender is on a continuum, and that sexual orientation is on a continuum, that means that this binary idea is a false dichotomy. There are other choices, and they're not mutually exclusive. And that's an important concept too. That's the main concept to understand when you're talking about these phenomena. So all three of these phenomena do exist on this continuum, and again, makes them not jointly exhaustive, meaning only two categories, either or mutually exclusive. Once you understand the false dichotomy of binary structure within sex and gender and orientation, then you can understand simple statements like you see here. And what you see up here is that sex does not equal gender. And what this means is that the biological sex that you're born into, whether it's male, female, or intersex, doesn't determine what gender you are. If you understand the false dichotomy of binary categories within sex, gender, and orientation, you're also going to understand this statement, which is saying gender identity does not equal sexual identity. And what that means is you can't assume that if you have someone who associates with the feminine, that they're necessarily going to be interested in someone of the masculine. That's not true, and we have lots of examples to kind of support that. So as I promised, we're going to focus on biological factors, but we want to keep in mind that as we're looking at these anatomical and physiological variations, culture environments still play a very critical role in shaping these processes. So the biology of sex, gender, and sexual orientation, these things are all intertwined and each inform the other. And so in addition to being influenced by biology, they're also influenced by cultural forces. So the biology that the foundation, that forms the foundation for sex, gender, and orientation, we're going to focus on these three categories here: chromosomal structure, the fertilization process, and also in utero sex differentiation. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, chromosomal variations in biological sex, and I've got a couple of examples here to show you. The first one is called Turner syndrome 45XO. The reason that it's called 45 is that it has to do with the normal, the difference between the normal amount of chromosomes that we have and what those individuals have if they've got Turner syndrome. So you and I get 23 chromosomes from our father and 23 chromosomes from our mother, giving us a total of 46 chromosomes. Someone that has Turner syndrome only has 45, and that's reflected in the XO characterization instead of the XX, which the individual should actually have. So these are females that will have one X chromosome instead of the usual XX chromosomal structure. Here's a second example. This one's called Klinefelter syndrome 47. And you notice that the last syndrome was 45, meaning there was one missing chromosomal structure. And then in Klinefelter's, you've got an extra one. So instead of 46, you've got 47. And that's reflected in the chromosomal structure that you see, XXY. So instead of the male only having the X and the Y chromosomal structure, there's an additional X that's added to these individuals. And so you can see there are a number of physiological effects that these chromosomal variations will have. In the females, you see over here that there are rudimentary ovaries. The ovaries do not develop, no menstruation. There will even be kind of skin features such as brown spots and things like that. And if we go over to Klinefelter syndrome, we can see that that extra X chromosome can cause feminine traits like less body hair and also breast enlargement. So when we're talking about these different types of physiological characteristics, first of all, it is going to involve the chromosomal variations that we just spoke about. It's also going to involve, the variation is also going to involve prenatal hormone variations that are involved in sexual differentiation processes in utero. And there are also some unclassified structures, meaning they don't quite know exactly what happens in the process to cause these variations in sex. So here we have a terrific video, and I am not going to play this video right now because I've noticed that with our Zoom lectures that sometimes when I share the videos with you, they lag a little bit, and it's just going to be easier if you watch this at home. So put this in your notes. I'm going to send out this link by announcements, but you can also Google it. And if you Google Armando Hasadungan And sex differentiation, again, that's Armando and Hassan Dugan, sex differentiation. This video will pop right up, and it's a very good one. He takes you through everything. So I'm going to, as you're writing Armando's name in your notes and sex differentiation, so you can Google it, I'm going to take you through some features that you need to note as you watch this short video. And so first of all, it's good news because this video is only about 12 minutes long. And what it is a recap of the feminization and masculinization processes, which you need to remember how this works because it's going to play into the epigenetics that we're going to be learning about in this section. Before watching, and put this in your notes, before watching, you need to keep certain facts in your mind. And so before actually playing this video, you want to write this down. Stress can increase adrenaline production. And if you keep that in your mind, as he goes through and shows you this differentiation process, you're going to kind of pick up on where this stress might cause some challenges or something to actually interact with this differentiation process. The second fact that you need to keep in your mind is that stress can also suppress the production of estrogen. Okay, so it can keep the levels of estrogen lower than they normally would be in a female. So knowing these two facts and having these two facts written down in your notes, you should try and answer this question after you watch the video. And the question you should try and answer is, what might be the results for the feminization process of a baby with XX, female, chromosomal structure if the mother happens to be under a lot of stress during the first 6 to 8 weeks of pregnancy? You'll only be able to answer this question if you pay close attention to the video and also keep those former facts that I just mentioned in mind. And so you should be striving to kind of answer that question. In addition to viewing the video, understanding the feminization and masculinization process, and doing your best to answer that question, you should make sure that you can define these vocabulary words. You can look at them before you watch the video or definitely after the video if you don't understand what they are after you watch the video. And those vocabulary words associated with this video are feminization, masculinization, SRY gene, you should know what it is and what the function of it is. The same thing with the SRY protein. You should know what bipotential gonads actually are. You need to know the function of the anti-Müllerian hormone, the function of DHT hormone, and also the function of testosterone within these processes. Oh, isn't he cute? All right, now you have an assignment. There's an exam buster, and it's called the epigenetic worksheet. And so this worksheet is going to have you watching the video that's done by Moshe Seif, and he happens to be an epigeneticist. And so he is going to explain to you exactly what epigenetics is. He does it a lot better than I do, so I'm going to kind of just hand over this job to him. But what you'll see in this picture here is you'll see something that's called a methylation map, and you'll notice that it has red aspects to it and it has green aspects to it. This is mapping out changes to the DNA. By the time you finish watching this video and doing your worksheet, you will know exactly what is meant when you're looking at a methylation map, what it means in what's happening to the genes when they turn green and what's happening to the genes when they turn red. It's really an important process, and it is the only way that you'll understand how we get some additional variation in gender expression and sexual orientation and biological sex. Now, Moshe is going to tell you about methylation mapping, but what he isn't going to talk about is he's not going to talk about the magic behind the process of this epigenetic change that we see in our DNA. And so I'm going to talk that through you, and it's important that you do understand this because you're going to be tested on this on your mini exam, and you're going to have some other exam busters and an additional time when this material is going to be on the mini exam. So let's take a look at epigenetic mechanisms, and I am going to give you just a brief definition of epigenetics working definition so we can kind of work through this process or the magic behind methylation changes to DNA. Genetics have to do with exactly probably what you think they have to do with, and that is DNA, or your permanent coding. Not that long ago, because we haven't really uncovered a lot of the mystery of the DNA, only recently within the last couple decades, but it used to be thought that your DNA was fixed. And so you were born, you had your DNA, that was how you were coded, and there was nothing you could do about that to change it. So just very kind of fixed idea behind what DNA did. As we have learned more about DNA, especially about DNA in disease processes, now we understand that there are epigenetic factors that can actually change our DNA. They don't necessarily alter it or create new variation, but instead they act on the existing variation within the DNA. And what they actually, epigenetic factors will do is they will turn on genes and they will shut genes off. And so they're changing the response of your DNA to your environment. So they can be extremely adaptive, but anything that has the potential to be adaptive in a wrong environment can be maladaptive. And the video will explain this to you very clearly. So again, DNA was considered to be static. Then we learned about a second layer called the epigenetic layer, which interacts with the environment. And depending upon what you're exposed to the environment can cause certain genes to turn on and other genes to turn off. So let's take a look at the magic behind this methylation process. And first, what we'll do is we'll start with some of the things that can actually cause these changes to occur in your DNA. And so right on top, and that's what we're most concerned with for sex, gender, and orientation, is this in utero or childhood development. And so epigenetic mechanisms can cause genes to turn on and turn off while you are developing inside your mother's womb. But these are generally in response to the environment that your mother is in. And so if your mother is in a stressful environment, that's going to change her hormone levels. If she's smoking, that's going to introduce other types of things to you while you are forming in utero that can cause things to turn on and off. In fact, they are definitely going to cause things to turn on and off with your DNA structure. All right, so development in utero, number one. Number two are environmental chemicals. And we, don't necessarily think too much about all the environmental chemicals that we happen to be exposed to, but we are exposed to a lot, and we don't have really anywhere close to understanding what the actual interactions or effects are to our DNA. And these include things like being exposed to for like cleaning products, for example, things in the water, excuse me, like runoff from farms, the fertilizer runoff from farms, aerolized things like exhaust from cars. There are just so many different things. There are pesticides, many different things that are in our foods, many things that we are exposed to on a daily basis that we don't have a really fundamental understanding of what the epigenetic effects actually are. One thing we don't tend to think about, and we tend to assume that if we are prescribed a drug, that the drug is something that is healthy and good for us. But unfortunately, sometimes drugs can cause, again, epigenetic changes, some things in your DNA to turn on and to turn off. And again, this is not a process that we understand very well because we're just learning that this was even something that happened to our DNA. So we're really in the early stages of understanding environment and how it shapes our DNA. Aging, of course, we know changes our DNA structure, and these are epigenetic changes, and it causes differences in our cellular regeneration and different things like that. And even something as innocuous as diet will definitely change our epigenetic structure. And so diets that are high in fat or diets that will cause us to be obese will change the way our DNA functions, and it will, again, turn things off and shut things on. Or shut things off, turn things on, shut things off. All right, health endpoints. Well, nope, we're gonna wait to that. So we started with epigenetic mechanisms up here. And you can see here that they got this lovely representation of this lovely purple chromosome. And what is flying off this chromosome here is called a chromatin, as so lovely kind of pointed out in this little diagram here. This chromatin will wind its way around, and what you see happening here is the onset of the methylation process. And that is where you have a methyl group that will attach itself to your DNA. When that methyl group attaches to the DNA, that's when the methylation occurs. And you can see it can have one of two effects. It will attach itself to this histone tail here on your gene, and it will cause the histone tail to wrap up. And if the histone tail wraps up, that DNA becomes inaccessible and the gene inactivates. The opposite of that, of course, is when it attaches to the histone tail and it actually unwraps. And then what happens is the gene that was once inactive is now active. And so this is the simplicity of the magic that happens with the methylation process. And so it is not really difficult to explain this to most people, the magic, things turning on and things shutting off. Now, the main concern here that we have with epigenetics is it relates to sex, gender, and orientation, but it also has healthcare endpoints that we will talk about when we get to reproduction. And so healthcare endpoints that we are concerned with when we talk about these epigenetic changes and these methylation changes is that they are linked to cancer conditions, okay? They're also linked to autoimmune diseases. They can be linked to mental disorders, and they are definitely linked to things like diabetes. And so sometimes these changes to our DNA don't equal good healthcare endpoints. And again, if you're thinking of a career, it certainly would be, you would definitely have a job if you went into epigenetics, because there's a lot of potential, future potential to help people with cures that are related to genetic types of solutions to diseases. Again, keep in mind that although what we're looking at are anatomical and physiological variation, culture plays a critical role in the process, and your social system plays a critical role in the process. And so what that means is, if we're talking about these epigenetic factors affecting the body and changing the DNA, your environment is going to be a big factor in that. And so if you happen to be, for example, poor, like what Moshe talks about in his TED Talk, you're in an environment that you might be exposed to more chemicals, you might have lower quality diet, you might not have access to healthcare or medicines that can kind of keep you at a better disease-resistant state. And so your culture or your society is going to have a direct effect on the structure of your DNA and your healthcare endpoints. All right, so now we're going to, we looked at processes based or founded on biology and physiology, but remember they're firmly rooted in culture. And we're going to move on to talk about childhood development, puberty, and young adulthood and adulthood. All right, you cannot talk about human sexual development and get away from Freud. It's just not going to happen. And you've already dealt with Freud when you guys built your timelines up. And what you see here is the classical schema, Freud's psychosexual stages. And some of you have heard them because they just happen to kind of, again, you're not going to get away from it. And if you take psychology or general psychology, you will encounter this again. But Freud says we all go through the oral stage when we're born to up to a year. And during that stage, our erogenous zone happens to be our mouth. Okay, so we get apparently sexual pleasure through the oral, through the mouth. Then we go through the anal stage from about 1 to 3 years, and then the erogenous zone becomes the bowel and the bladder, because I guess during that stage we learn how to go to the bathroom ourselves. The third stage is the phallic stage, 3 to 6 years, and then the erogenous zone becomes the genitals. And the latent stage, age 6 to puberty, is when the libido becomes inactive. And then we get to the genital stage where we go through puberty to death, where we have maturing sexual interests. And so these psychosexual stages that Freud developed years ago, we still kind of adhere to the idea that humans do go through stages, but they're not associated with sexual pleasure for obvious reasons. So some of Freud's ideas have kind of fallen by the wayside, and others have stuck around, and it's very difficult to get rid of the founding ideas of any particular discipline, especially Freud in psychology. All right, so more developmental theories. And what you see here is an old magazine called Life and Style. Pretty soon we won't have magazines anymore anyway. But anyway, this headline you can see asks, why is Angelina turning Shiloh into a boy? And so for those of you who don't know who Angelina is, they're talking about Angelina Jolie, and she's always getting in trouble. And if you look at the headline, you can see, you know, they're trying to insinuate that Angelina Jolie is trying to turn her daughter into a boy by allowing her daughter to wear clothes that happen to be slightly masculine, right? They're not overtly masculine, but they're slightly masculine. And so this kind of ties into a developmental theory called gender role nonconformity. And this developmental theory focuses on kids who display cross-gender traits, and it says that they're more likely to be homosexual as adults. Okay, so this is an idea that's founded on correlation, okay, not actually causation. And the reason that we know it doesn't follow causation, and it's not really a sound theory, is because we know many gay men who were not effeminate children, and they're not effeminate adults. And not all effeminate boys are gay as adults. We now understand better the role of biology in shaping gender and orientation instead of this foundation of gender nonconformity. All right, so this one, this gender role nonconformity is no longer accepted by the psychological community writ large. Oh, there's my little Oedipus T-Rex. Yeah, really cute. Again, you can't get away from Freud. And you cannot talk about sexuality if you don't talk about Freud and his connection to Greek mythology and the Oedipal complex. And if we were in class, it would be a lot of fun because I could ask which one of you was a Greek scholar, and inevitably there's always one or two of you who do an excellent job explaining what Oedipus went through during his tragedy, because the Greek love their tragedies. And for those of you that don't know the Oedipal tale, what happens to Oedipus is he's born. His father finds out from some ladies who predict the future that his son is going to grow up and kill him. He likes his little baby son. He doesn't want to kill it, and so he thinks he can trick this fate by giving his son away to someone else. So the son grows up, he doesn't know that the king is his father, and lo and behold, the son falls in love with his mother. Again, we're talking Greek tragedies, and he wants to marry his mother, and the only way he can do that is by killing his father, and so it actually, the prediction actually comes true. And so for Freud, he links this Oedipal theory to male homosexuality. And how does he do this? What he says is that the male homosexuals, their desire for their mother becomes so strong that they can't murder their father, because that's not approved of. And so because they can't do that, then they want their mother so badly, they start to identify with her and start to become her. And so he does the same for the lesbians. He says that the reason that lesbians are lesbians is because they want their fathers so much and they can't have their fathers, and so therefore they just reject all males. Now, the interesting thing about Freud's theory is that he creates this theory based on a stereotype. And so Freud never really spent or did any ethnographies or spent a lot of time around homosexual people. He just based it on stereotypes. And so the stereotype during Freud's time it can be similar to some of the stereotypes that we have today, where homosexual males are just by default considered to be feminine. And so he takes this stereotype and then he turns it into his theory without actually talking to or doing any research with homosexual males to figure out from them that they don't really desire their mothers and they never have desired their mothers, and it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. Now, interestingly enough, the reason that I had you guys do the timeline in the first module was so you can get an idea of how ideas actually kind of are cyclical. They kind of come around. So here we have a researcher called Evelyn Hooker in 1953. And Evelyn actually spent a lot of time with homosexual males and homosexual females, doing a lot of interviews with them. And by the time Evelyn got done actually talking to homosexual males and homosexual females, she quickly came to the conclusion that there was nothing wrong with these individuals, that they were smart, they weren't deviant, they were just like everybody else, except for they had a different sexual orientation. And she comes to this conclusion in 1953. Now, the reason that Evelyn's findings don't really change the way the culture at large viewed sexuality or viewed homosexuals in 1953 has a lot to do with gender positions in 1953. And so Evelyn Hooker comes out with this excellent research project, very good book. It's well respected to this day. And her male colleagues who had been steeped in Freudian backgrounds looked at her work and said, oh, that's very nice, sweet Miss Evelyn, but could you go back to the kitchen right now and let the boys go back to work, you know, with the theories that we know, that we believe to be true. And so Evelyn's work, largely because she was a woman, and also because it went against the founding father of Freud, was largely dismissed in 1953. Today, almost everything that Evelyn put forth in her book is accepted. So part of the reason that we need to review these developmental theories that are now defunct is because these ideas will keep coming back unless you understand what the theories are and why they aren't true. And that's part of an education, a social science education. And we need to know these things because if we believe that some of these situations are true, then it seems like reparative therapy or conversion therapy, where you try and talk someone out of their sexual orientation, might actually work if it is a developmental or psychological issue instead of normal sexual variation. Again, no longer accepted by the psychological community writ large. Here's another developmental theory called peer group interaction. And this one says that children who develop early sexually will become aroused while still with their same-sex peers. And so let's say, for example, that little Lucy starts to sexually develop when she's maybe 8 years old. And she's still playing with her same-sex peers, then she's just going to become attracted to them somehow because she's developing early. And they're basing the individuals who are proponents of this peer group interaction base their idea on the fact that homosexuals tend to report earlier sexual contacts than heterosexuals. And that statement is all but false. There's actually no data that actually really supports that idea. And another thing that we need to think about, if this peer group interaction theory, hard to say, is true, then we need to kind of think about what might happen in the future, and here's why. What we know now as far as maturation and menses is that women are going through it at a much younger age. The average age used to be 12 for the onset of menses, but now there are girls as young as 8 that are going into menses. The reason that these girls are going into menses as early as the age of 8 is related to the estrogen that is pumped into the milk supply that we have. That's the leading theory for that. But let's go back to peer group interaction. So if this is true, if peer group interaction theory is really true, and now all girls are going to get their menses and start going through puberty at the age of 8, what that would mean is that we are going to have just lesbians only, right? It'll just be lesbians only, which is a preposterous idea. And I know when I introduce some of these theories and I tell you about them, before I even tell you that they've been debunked, that in your mind you're going, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But prior to having a lot of the molecular and biological knowledge that we have, these were the ideas that were kind of floating about. And again, this idea is no longer accepted, of course. All right, behaviorist theories. Here's one that says that if you reinforce homosexual tendencies, like they kind of accused Angelina Jolie of doing, and then punish heterosexual tendencies, that you can create a homosexual. And so this is based on the idea that a parent would condition their child to be a homosexual. there's a huge problem with this theory, and that is that even if I did wake up in the morning and say to myself, you know what, I really want a nice homosexual kid, I'm going to have a baby and I'm just going to punish them every time they exhibit heterosexual behaviors. The problem is I can punish them all I want, but society is not going to provide the reinforcement, and your individual development is intrinsically tied not just to your parental support, but also to your community support or your cultural support. And so, number one, society and culture don't support this, but of course, we know again that a lot of the variation that we see in sex and gender and in orientation is going to have a biological foundation, not a developmental one. All right, interactional theory. Here's one that says that gender conforming kids prefer the other sex. Okay, so that means, if you're gender conforming, you're a cisgender. The second part of the interactional theory says that non-conforming children will prefer the same sex. And the reason has to do with what is termed within interactional theory as the exotic becomes erotic. And so, for example, a trans woman, right, that means that that individual was born a biological male, but their gender is female. This theory says they don't want to be with another woman because they are a woman, right? That's boring. Instead, she'd want the exotic or man. And this doesn't hold water for so many reasons. There's no empirical support, but also what we know about trans individuals, again, gender identity does not equal sexual identity. There are plenty of trans women who like women, and there are plenty of trans women who like men. And so it's not predictive, and therefore interactional theory, again, no longer accepted by the psychological community writ large. And one more time, just kind of review why we learn these older, outdated theories is because if you don't learn them and people come forth with these ideas, you don't understand why these ideas are not going to work or not true. And so by learning them, you're not going to reinvent the wheel, and you're also not going to entertain ideas that have been soundly rejected by the scientific community. So instead, when we're talking about developmental focuses or foci for children and young adults, we are changing or shifting. And so you can see with those developmental theories and interactional theories that they're kind of obsessed with development and what they consider to be deviant development. And that has shifted completely. And so instead of the psychological community being focused on trying to fix children as they're growing up, they are trying to be a support system and kind of help guide them through the hurdles that we kind of put in front of them as a culture for sexual development. And so you can see what you have here is you've got a movement that's kind of sponsored by a psychological group called ACT for Youth Center of Excellence. And it has a bunch of ideas on there, like I am able to set appropriate boundaries, I act responsibly according to my personal values, I have the ability to communicate effectively with my peers and family and partners. Instead, psychologists are less focused on trying to fixate on someone's identity or orientation, and more fixated on helping them integrate within the community in a healthy way. So our ending note on looking at these theories, these developmental theories, is why psychologists acknowledge now that there are developmental milestones for human sexual development. They absolutely are. Simplistic explanations regarding variations in gender and sexual orientation have been abandoned. And instead, a more nuanced approach that considers the interplay between biology and the social environment is what has been adopted. This is in your textbook, and I really like it. And it outlines the current developmental concerns. It starts off with what individuals face as they go through puberty, and that is how an individual goes about establishing their sexual orientation. And what we know about sexual orientation now that we've gone through this lecture is there is a very strong biological component, but actually living that lived experience of different sexual or variations in sexual orientation is directly related to your cultural environment. how we integrate love and sex, because those are two different things. And so depending upon what stage of life you're in, you might be more focused on sex rather than actually a love relationship. And how do you actually pull in sex into a love relationship? That can be challenging sometimes, especially when you shift from one goal to another. You might shift from, in other words, when you're in college, you're not really shopping for a permanent mate, but then when you're done with college and you're ready to move on, you might want to start a family. Now you have to take behaviors that have been ingrained as far as sexual practice, and now you have to kind of change that script a little bit and kind of integrate it into a long-term relationship. It can be very challenging. And that, of course, involves the next bullet point, which is forging intimacy and actually making a commitment. Making fertility and childbearing decisions are of great interest to young adults because they can be, again, very contentious. The type of birth control you use, whether you can afford to use birth control, whether you need to have an abortion or you want to use the next day pill, or if you've decided you really do not want to have children at all and you're doing so at the age of 25, and then you cannot find someone to actually help you get permanent contraceptive options. Practicing safer sex to avoid sexually transmitted infections can be contentious, and we will talk about that when we get to the STI section. And now we've reached the point where I'm going to offer you an extra credit response. And so this extra credit response is related to this last bullet point, which is called Evolving a Sexual Philosophy. And this is one of the bullet points that I particularly like a lot in the textbook. And in this particular developmental concern, what happens when you're a young adult is you are switching over. And so when you are under the care of your parents, your morals and your ideas about what are right and wrong are governed by authority. Once you leave your parents and you go to college and you start to work on your own, you have to develop your own moral compass and develop your own philosophy. And so this extra credit is you doing just that. And you'll see, you will actually see the prompt when you click into the response section on Canvas.